Thank you to everyone here and to everyone who brought me here. And I'm sorry this will be a bit fast, but I hope understandable. So in the spirit of vulnerability, generosity, and kinship that each of you shared your activist and scholarly and artistic projects, I share a very short excerpt from my ongoing work in Afghanistan. And it's also just to demonstrate that although I am here as an annoying provocateur, I am also someone who is embedded in activist and scholarly projects and commitments myself. So I'm starting with an excerpt from my field notes in Kabul in 2008, Kabul, Afghanistan. A program for food ration distribution to widows and their families began in Kabul city in 1996 to address the profound food insecurity throughout Afghanistan that resulted from consecutive wars, conflicts, and droughts. By providing monthly rations of fortified wheat flour, vegetable oil, red beans, and iodized salt to every beneficiary, the program aimed to assuage malnutrition and increase household food security. Initially, 10,000 widows in Kabul were beneficiaries of the aid program. Including the people living in their households, this amounted to approximately 50,000 of the most vulnerable inhabitants of the city being assisted. However, starting in 2007, the number of widow beneficiaries was gradually reduced. I observed ration distributions in 5 districts of Kabul for 3 years and witnessed how each of the staff members were asked to be highly vigilant and to repeatedly question and re-question and verify the widow's family information, often in rapid-fire fashion. It went something like this. What is your father's name? What is your husband's name? How many years have you been a widow? How many children do you have? How many sons do you have? How old are they? Do any of them work? And who else is living in your house? Through this process of biopolitical scrutiny, the widows were continually forced to prove and perform their widowhood. Every month, 3 or 4 interrogations on each distribution day, a lingering, ongoing suspicion, which for some widows had been ongoing for decades. Now, one day in January of 2008, 2 women approached me. Hisab Kunin Hamshira Jan, they requested. I had never seen these 2 women before in this particular ration distribution center. However, we were familiar with each other's faces, as they had both been part of another organization's monthly rations program. Hisab Kunin Hamshira Jan means please do the math, dear sister. The women who approached me to help them were not part of this particular ration distribution program, but were formulating their pleas to be considered. These women who approached me were cut, meaning they were deemed not as needy and will no longer be eligible to receive rations from another ration distribution program in the city, and were instructed to go to the CARE program, as it was larger, better funded, and had more flexible criteria. The 2 women who approached me were told by the other widows that I did not work for the organization, but I was there every month talking to the widows and helping them in small ways as they needed. In essence, they presented me as someone who was not restricted by employment regulations and loyalties, and I had a fairly good sense of the processes and criteria, not only of this organization, but many throughout the city. These women needed my help in altering the dates their husbands actually died. Our husbands died before the Taliban. But we will not get included in the program if we tell the NGO this. We know this. They are cutting beneficiaries in this program and all programs every month throughout the city, and they will only keep the ones whose husbands were killed by the Taliban, suspected the women. We have figured out that if you tell the aid organizations who work in Afghanistan that the Taliban killed your husband or bombed your house, you get special treatment and assistance. We are not useful, and they do not care if you tell them that the Soviets killed our husbands, or if they died in the Kabul Wars in the 1990s, or if our husbands died young because there was no hospitals to treat even simple diseases. They only care if the Taliban made us widows. The women were sure that they could get the necessary documents forged from their community leaders that verified that the Taliban killed their husbands. All they needed now was my help in, quote, doing the math, to pass the series of rapid-fire questions the staff members would ask them to make it believable that the death of their husbands could be attributed to the Taliban. Now, I stop here, but will summarize what I continue to do in the rest of this chapter that's a part of my book that I'm working on now. And this chapter is titled Talibanization, Liberal Regimes of Truth and the Social Production of Evil. And I narrate in the rest of the piece chapter everyday scenes throughout Kabul and Pakistan as I have come to know these places as a researcher over the last 20 years. And the unifying thread is not only the spectral presence of the Taliban in these narratives and beyond, but the unspoken, accompanying authoritative voice that uttering the Taliban has in the contemporary, particularly when speaking in liberal audiences in the West, but not only in the West. So that's a very specific excerpt from my work that's ongoing. And keep in mind that that excerpt I read you is from Field Notes in 2008, so now is your question of time and sort of the ethnographic presence and how I write about it in a book that will be coming out in 17 or 18, right, based on fieldwork. So that's just the long temporality involved in the work we do and how then we reflect on it. So from this very short excerpt from my work, I go to the general, and my work in general looks at how war and humanitarianism are both being mutually constituted by each other. And what I mean by this is these humanitarians that are there in Afghanistan to help widows, but there would not have been so many widows if there had not been so much war. And in Afghanistan, we're not just talking about the present war since 2001, but Syrian war since 1978. So if we remember that one of the justifications for the most recent war was saving women, so war was presented as an act of care. You help women of Afghanistan by creating the conditions of possibility for their husbands to be killed. So I'm not only speaking here when I'm talking about war and humanitarianism to say that they coexist in the same space. I'm actually saying that they're mutually dependent on each other and they need each other. War is hand in hand with humanitarianism, and humanitarians are hand in hand with war and the war machine. And this is the purposeful, in my work, I'm demonstrating the purposeful paradox that lies at the heart of the modern liberal state. The purposeful paradox that lies at the heart of the modern liberal state, cruelty and compassion, violence and care, that do not only coexist, but are dependent on each other and mutually constitute each other and get practiced through the juridical and other arms of the state and the global racialized capitalist structure that the states are invested in keeping. So some themes that resonate from my work into many of the projects that I've learned so much from in the last days. One is the theme of disposability, right? And humans as disposable. So war, liberalism, humanitarianism, capitalism, racism, white supremacy, these all have created the conditions of possibility for why Afghans are disposable. The question of disposability of life and who is constituted as human or not. The disposability that created the conditions of possibility for the students from Ayotzinapa to be disappeared, to the racialized violence in Cape Town, the dislocated and dispossessed in Beijing, Hamburg, and the Bombay projects, and the everyday ways disposability works in the racialized global capitalist militarized system. So this idea of disposability and its relationship and complicity with state violence. Then another of the themes is the victimhood narrative, right? So a lot of the projects brought up resistance to this victimhood narrative. Through my short excerpt that I've shared of the widows in Afghanistan who have had to play into the victim narratives to get material benefits in the forms of monthly rations. It's not only victimhood, but a particular victim narrative. It's the Taliban that had to have killed their husbands, not all the wars that came prior or the Americans in the current or the NATO, right? It had to be a very specific form of victimhood. And that makes us think about, Abi Mola that spoke about the crisis in Hamburg and Sophie that was saying, who are the Afghans? Is their state safe enough or not? And how decisions are being made that Syrian refugees are somehow more relevant and timely than Afghans. And added to this whole victim narrative is the performing of this beneficial recipient, right? So they have to perform like they're grateful, full knowing that it is owed to them, but they're taking, and that they're taken care of. For them, in their ideas, it's a form of reparations, but in the languages of the state, it's humanitarianism and care. But they have to simultaneously perform within these things. So throughout the projects, the victim narrative that is being resisted was quite inspiring to see. So it's present in Gabriel's work and project in Cape Town, to Mexico's team's uneasiness with a shift in moral authority that made the parents and relatives of the disappeared to be the moral voice because of their proximity to loss and violence, to the team in Bombay, who had wanting to avoid completely the development discourses to view those who are displaced not as victims, but creators and curators, readers and writers of poetry, to the migrants in Hamburg, not just a special population who needs attention in development practice, as the widows in Afghanistan. So the resistance to the victimhood narratives, to the discourses of state and the racialized capitalist structure. And pushing from Rohit's presentation from the Zurich group, he spoke of, so the aid, as I mentioned before, the aid that the widows receive is understood by them as reparations, even as they perform as the gracious recipients. But in state development and international aid language, it is humanitarianism and care. And keep in mind here what is so violently expected from those who have been subject serially to violence. They need to be the graceful recipient of our care, right? So from the victim narrative and how that's being resisted throughout many of these projects is this idea of also belonging. Who can belong and how much? And this is from the concept note, but it resonated in many of the projects. I'm wanting to train our eyes on the questions of exclusions, whether they're more deliberate forms of exclusions that come from a very legitimate form of politics, a radical support of LGBT individuals and communities in St. Petersburg, or a condition for the existence of a space in Bombay, where the foundational moment, the very possibility itself of the space to be erected, was the building of a wall to keep people out from the adjacent slum. Foundational act of exclusion to ultimately create and cultivate a space of inclusion. Also in the Hong Kong project, the reinscribing of the primacy of the visual and not wanting to fetishize sound or exoticize the ear, but what violence may be done in the reinscribing notions of the normative body. Many scholars like Judith Butler have taught us in terms of decentering normative claims, whether in terms of sexuality or in abilities of the body to hear or not to see, or see and not to hear. Disability studies have taught us a lot about being attentive, I would say radically attentive, to the intentional and unintentional forms of exclusion that reside in the projects and spaces we are crafting and cultivating. So think about the ways that we can account for, and if it's appropriate, support other counter-publics that emerge in the everyday spaces of the places we inhabit that do not get funding from draft, whether it's counter-publics, including widows that I've met, and the counter-publics they created in the city of Kabul. So my work as an anthropologist, I work across in multi-methodological, all kinds of forms of data, but really insights that we get into the aspects of the lives we try to understand is through ethnographic fieldwork, exposing yourself to the world and using your body as an instrument of data collection, a practice that artists are very familiar with. There may be a potential or need for mutual learning. What I mean is scholars and anthropologists can learn from artists with how to communicate more effectively at the registers of the affective, while artists may want to incorporate more explicit forms of self-reflexivity in the presentations of the narratives that inform their art, and not necessarily only in the art themselves. And then again, it's just a larger point about paying attention to the messiness, as the messiness is precisely where the nuance resides. The nuance that's so important in the practice of art, but in the remaking of the political that so many of us are invested in. In between the rehearsals, for example, in the orchestra in Hong Kong, the everyday tensions and small dramas that happen in between the harmonious notes in music. What are the tensions there? The dramas there to negotiate space and recraft space in Bombay, St. Petersburg, to literally take note, meaning maybe we just need to go to the old school method of taking notes, right? The act of writing it down is self-reflexive in some ways in itself, but it produces a different kind of archive that can help us politically and artistically. To go from Zheng comment to cultivating our abilities to tap into the affective dimensions of politics, as the right-wing nutters have done so well. How can we tap, meaning those with different political aspirations, into the affective registers to inform radically new ways and forms of politics that are required? And Cuauhtemoc said very elegantly in the first day, the means of production have changed and our forms of struggle need to change as well. Clearly, this is what is happening in these projects here, and there's new ways of articulating social justice. And I'll just end on this final note, that I've lived here in Zurich for 2 years, a few years back. I taught at the University of Zurich. And I'm part of a German-speaking family in Switzerland. And while I'm a person who has grown up speaking English and Spanish in Los Angeles, I have learned, and through the process of my life trajectories and field work and activist commitments, I've learned Persian, Urdu, Pashto, and Arabic and many different languages, yet I resist learning German. So because of the expectations to be the good migrant, I must learn the language. But I've resisted, and it has been really, really inspiring and refreshing to be here in Switzerland, to have such an engaged and honest and enduring conversation about radical politics, including the problems of white supremacy. And this only happened when I sat in Zurich and other places in Switzerland with a group of like-minded friends. I've never had a space like this in Switzerland, so you have all made me have a different relationship to the city. It may not result in any immediate desire to learn German, but all of you have helped me to renegotiate my relationship to the city, and I sincerely thank each of you individually for that and so much more, and Draft for putting me in your paths. Thank you.